been thinking about producing a video about grief for weeks, months, probably years. And finally, we decided to put it together because we received a couple of stimulants. I received a text message from somebody I'm not going to name, and we received a link to an article in the New York Times Magazine, also from somebody that will remain unnamed. And these two pieces of information pushed us into actually finally putting together this recording.
There have been a lot of interruptions. So, we attended the Grief Recovery Institute in 2014.
January of 2014.
January of 2014 in Phoenix.
In Phoenix, Arizona.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And the reason we did that is there were many people asking Guy how to deal with the impending demise of not just our species, but all life on Earth. Very few therapists out there are knowledgeable of NTHE and might not be ready for this.
That's near-term human extinction, if you've been paying attention. And therapists are not knowledgeable about near-term human extinction, and if they were knowledgeable, I suspect they would ignore it anyway. Because there's a lot of money to be made in making sure people stay within Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. And there's no money to be made in extinction. There's no money to be made in counseling people about extinction. That's a fast track to losing all your clients. So we see a lot of people using grief work as a means of making money. We don't think that's a great idea because it ignores the truth that grief is an emotional syndrome that can be recovered from. Just as with physical phenomena, physical injuries, for example, there is a way to deal with emotional injury that is a positive path.
Right.
The Grief Recovery Institute has been pointing out that positive path literally for decades.
I think one of the most helpful metaphors that was given to us when we took our workshop initially was that dealing with grief is a lot like taking care of a flat tire. You can't just wait for a flat tire to heal itself. It doesn't heal over time. Grief also doesn't heal over time. In fact, we can carry grief with us for decades. We might not necessarily feel it as keenly as we did initially.
Unresolved grief. We can carry with us for decades.
Right.
This idea that time heals all wounds is just wrong.
Well, I think that came because people tend to, get distracted by life as life goes on. And so you're not thinking about the person that you love who left or died as much. But if you did sit down and start thinking about it, all those feelings would come right back. That's unresolved grief. That's still grief happening in the moment. And grief, the Grief Institute.
The Grief Recovery
Institute. Grief Recovery Institute is not about stopping your feelings. That is not what grief recovery is. Grief recovery is recognizing your feelings and understanding that you were looking for a different past. You were looking for a different kind of relationship. And you didn't get that. And now, how do you deal with that? Many therapists try to help people forget about those feelings or work through those feelings and try to fill them with something else. Have an activity, find a hobby, keep yourself busy. But those things don't heal that grief. They don't recover you from the grief itself. That takes a different kind of path, a different journey, and work, personal work.
I have a story to tell.
Mm-hmm.
Of course I do. Jerry Kramer,
Hmm.
the man from Idaho who basically invented the pulling guard in football. It didn't exist until he played for Vince Lombardi and the Green Bay Packers. And Jerry Kramer was a logger as well. He was a woods worker.
Hmm.
And at some point, he became injured in that occupation. And he had a huge splinter in his stomach.
What?
Can you imagine? And imagine if somebody would have said, "Time will heal that, Jerry. You just got to let it go." And they'd left the splinter in there. He would have almost certainly died, or at least been impaired for a long time as a result. And it's the same thing when we have an emotional wound, when we have a splinter in our heart.
Hmm. Or a
You can
sliver in
just
your liver?
you can just leave it alone. You can ignore it
Hmm.
and rely on the notion that time heals all wounds,
Right.
but it won't. Just as removing that sliver was the only way out for Jerry Kramer,
Hmm.
so too a more positive route, a more positive path for those of us who have emotional distress
Hmm.
is to deal with it and remove the source of the pain
Hmm.
instead of just turning away and acting as if it doesn't happen.
Right. Yep. The notion that grief recovery means you stop loving that person or caring about whoever it is that you're trying to recover grief from. It doesn't it does not mean that. And it doesn't mean that you stop being sad. Sadness is different from grieving. We carry grief deep inside of us. And we can still be sad that someone's gone and still perform rituals to remember them with. But that doesn't, that's a different thing from trying to cut your emotions off and just forget about that person, which is what a lot of, from what I've been reading, there's a Freudian background to that, just cutting those feelings off.
Right, that's the Freudian path, at least one of the Freudian paths to dealing with grief is to forget about it for all practical purposes. The way of moving forward from that perspective, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we get to the
Mm-hmm.
article in New York Times Magazine. The path forward, the approach that was proposed and implemented by Freud and the many people he worked with was to put it aside. Just
Mm-hmm.
forget about it. Don't think about it. Eventually it will go away. That's how you reach closure is by not thinking about something,
Mm-hmm.
occupying yourself with other things, with
Mm-hmm.
other activities. And yes, that typically works, at
Mm-hmm.
least for a while, at least for a short time.
Mm-hmm.
But not dealing with emotional pain is analogous to not dealing with that enormous sliver Jerry Kramer had in his stomach.
Mm-hmm.
In very few cases is it going to get better over time if you just ignore it.
Right.
Okay, so let's move on to these couple of things.
Well, I also think we need to make sure that people know that we're not therapists. We're not certified counselors. But what we are is grief recovery specialists. And that is what we're qualified to do. So people have called us therapists or grief counselors. Not in our
And we have
that's not
never
what we do.
claimed to be counselors
Right.
or therapists.
But we are
We,
people who have felt grief
yes, and
deeply.
and people who have brought it to other people,
Mhm.
particularly in my case,
Right.
coincidentally.
Right. And I think, it's so interesting because we really, really wanted to offer the NTHE community a way to process anticipatory grief. And now we've just had this year of absolute tragedy from the pandemic. So, I mean, the grief recovery process is very timely and very helpful for many people. And I really recommend people reading the book. The Grief Recovery Handbook is incredibly vital.
I'm absolutely certain that had one of the people read the relatively short book and completed the simple, straightforward exercises in the book, that this person would not have committed suicide. I'm certain of that with respect to at least one individual. And we recommended time and time again that this person read this book. It's a quick read. It's called the Grief Recovery Handbook. The second 20-year anniversary edition was published in 2009.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a wonderful, compelling set of materials that allows a positive path forward
Mm-hmm.
and allows people to get unmired
Mm-hmm.
from the grief that professional counselors want you to get mired in,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what makes the money for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, every time you go into therapy, what do? So tell me about your miserable childhood.
Right.
And then all those feelings come back up, and then it's time to go. Oh, look at the time.
See you next week, same time, same station.
But wait.
Okay, so this is one of the pieces of information that came to us specifically. It came to me, and it's referring to one of the recent videos that we put out. And it says, I spoke with Dr. Wadhams about that latest news. He too is pretty depressed, as am I. And I responded relatively cryptically for a couple of reasons. One, I'm tapping away on my phone and I can't do the thumb thing, so I'm typing one digit at a time with my finger. And two, I don't owe this person and his 4 or 5 houses anything. This is a person who has not taken my work seriously and who continues to get mired in misinformation and his own personal grief, despite the information we have provided to him. So, again, his text message to me, I spoke with Dr. Wadhams about that latest news. He too is pretty depressed, as am I. And my response, again, quite cryptic. Anyone who's been paying attention to my work, promulgating the research of others, is either depressed or in acceptance of the situation. I moved beyond depression many years ago, in part because I chose not to bring children into the impending disaster I could see in 1979 at the age of 19. That I've been deplatformed ensures more depression and confusion among the masses as habitat continues to be lost for our species. Again, this is a relatively short note that has behind it thousands of hours of critical thinking and a lot of writing and a lot of producing videos. So it might sound as if I'm glossing over the situation. I'm not. It's just that I don't have time to respond to every single misinformed, willfully misinformed person who sends me an email message proclaiming their sadness about one thing or another. I've offered a way out. We've offered a way out
Mm-hmm.
for a very long time. And yet we continue to receive this kind of message from people almost every day.
Yeah, but it is depressing
It
knowing
is.
that our entire species and every other living thing on Earth is going away.
Yes.
And that is a very difficult thing to process.
Right. And
Which
and so I called the Grief Recovery Institute has two founders, John W. James and Russell Friedman. And I called John W. James died a couple of years ago. I called Russell Friedman about 6 years ago
yeah.
from my home in New Mexico and talked to him about our work, the work that we had proposed, which is offered in the Grief Recovery Workshop. And we kept getting stuck on the same point. I would say over and over again that dealing with anticipatory grief at large scale is a positive path forward, and it allows people to remain within the moment, to remain living in the here and now. And his constant response for an hour and a half that we talked on the phone was, no, that takes people out of the moment. Anticipatory grief at large scale takes people out of the moment instead of having them
Yeah.
remain in the moment. And we just went back and forth and we never resolved that issue.
Yeah.
I wanted to work more closely with the Grief Recovery Institute, and it was pretty clear they wanted nothing to do with our idea
Right.
about anticipatory grief at scale. Now, I don't know whether that was driven by money. They've influenced more than 1 million people
Mm-hmm.
with their grief recovery program, and we have influenced 5. Okay, maybe 8 people, not very many in any event. And I wanted to have some format for us dealing with this issue of anticipatory grief at large scale
Mm-hmm.
so that it influenced positively more people.
Right.
And we just haven't been able to accomplish that
Mm.
through the paths we've been taking,
Right.
which is too bad. It has not helped that I, and by extension you, have been deplatformed
Mm-hmm. Right.
by a coordinated effort, a coordinated campaign
Yep.
to basically destroy my life.
And mine.
Your life was destroyed pretty much the minute we got together. So you
Thank
can't
you.
blame other people for that.
Thank
That's
you.
all on me.
Thank you.
So again, the approach we've been using for more than 7 years now is offered by the Grief Recovery Institute and is rooted in the Grief Recovery Handbook, the 20-year edition of which second edition was published in 2009. So it was about 5 years old when we became familiar with it and beginning using it as the basis for dealing with grief in our own lives
Mm-hmm.
and also suggesting it as an alternative so that people could deal with grief in their lives as well. Then turn to the article that was sent to us by a friend from New York Times Magazine, published December 15th, 2021. The title is, What If There's No Such Thing as Closure? Interestingly, this article deals with anticipatory grief at scale, but doesn't call it that. It refers to Professor Emeritus at the University of Minnesota, Pauline Boss, and her book, The Myth of Closure, which came out in December of 2021, just earlier this month, as this video is being produced.
And I just want to point out that she may be Pauline Boss, but I'm Pauline the Boss.
Well, we don't know her middle name.
Well, that's true.
So she might think she's the boss as
That
well.
could be. That could be.
So there's a lot of confused people out there.
Right.
Anyway, his article in the New York Times Magazine was called What If There's No Such Thing as Closure? And it features 87-year-old Professor Emeritus at the University of Minnesota, Pauline Boss. And in general, it's really a well-done article and quite lengthy. We include a link to the article, to the book, The Grief Recovery Handbook, and to our workshop, Only Love Remains, at the blog post coincident with the release of this video. You can find that blog post at guymcpherson.com, coincident upon release of this video on YouTube.
And of which our own workshop, we have none scheduled or planned for the future.
Because the pandemic goes on.
Right.
Omicron is still with us, and there's more to come.
Yeah.
Omicron is not Omega.
No, it's not.
It's not the end.
No.
So I suspect that we have not seen the worst of what's to come with respect to the pandemic.
Oh, really?
I would like to think that we have seen the worst of what's to come, that the millions of people who died so far will be the end of it, but I don't think so. We'll see. Maybe I'm just hopelessly pessimistic. Maybe. I've been called worse.
Right.
So this article, what if there's no such thing as closure, written by Meg Bernard, December 15th, 2021, and updated December 19th, 2021 at New York Times Magazine. We'll include a link. Okay. When I first visited, this is written by Meg Bernard, when I first visited Pauline Boss in late May, Minneapolis was on the cusp of fully reopening. Boss, who is 87, greeted me in her building's lobby wearing thick frame glasses, her light blonde hair short, and an Apple Watch clasped on her left wrist. She cautiously extended a hand toward me. Can we shake hands? She asked, smiling. Dare we? We did.
Because they were being cautious for the pandemic.
Right. And as we've discussed in our conversations off the air,
Mm-hmm.
could you come up with a less relevant paragraph to lead an important article such as this one?
Mm-hmm.
To spend half of the words in the lead describing what boss looks like,
Her
what
hair.
she's wearing, what her hair looks like, what she is wearing on her wrist.
She's got an Apple Watch.
We're talking about something really important here. The headline leads us to believe through the words, what if there's no such thing as closure? Leads us to believe that we're going to talk about something quite important here. And then we talk about her Apple Watch. You have some gray hair too, I notice.
Oh,
Should
yeah.
we talk about that for the lead?
Not bottle blonde.
Okay, anyway, your take on this extensive article.
So, the thesis is that there may not be closure for the grief that we have because there are different kinds of grief. And Professor Boss has identified several different types of grief that aren't accepted in normal society as valid or important enough to warrant support. She has termed that type of grief as ambiguous grief, which I understand what she's trying to do, but it's disconcerting because grief is grief. And the term itself, ambiguous, is ambiguous because it doesn't really quite describe what that is. But she's based an entire theory of grief on this term, and it has a life of its own. She's got peer-reviewed papers on it, and so the question is your grief that you're feeling because you are the descendant of a slave, is that ambiguous grief? Is the grief that you feel when you're a black man or woman and you get up in the morning and you walk out your door and you're not sure if you're going to be safe or if your kids are going to be safe? Is that grief ambiguous? Is it not quite, are you not quite certain that you have grief about that or not? I disagree. I think that is real solid and valid grief in the moment, and I don't think there's anything ambiguous about that type of grief. And so this is where everything else that Professor Voss talks about is wonderful and poignant, because there are so many types of grief out there that have nothing to do with people who have died. They have to do with people who are missing in your life, or friendships that no longer exist, family members that you've lost over the years, and maybe even losing losing a job can be completely grief ridden and just devastate people. So this is really important that we recognize that grief is not ambiguous. You feel things, definitely.
And in the Grief Recovery Handbook,
Mm-hmm.
James and Friedman pointed out that there are 43 different kinds of grief.
Right.
This book is very, very heavily evidence-based.
Mm-hmm.
It turns very frequently to the peer-reviewed literature, including, for example, when they identify the 43 different kinds of grief.
Right.
To call some of these types of grief ambiguous,
Yeah.
I think, detracts from the importance of various kinds of grief.
Right.
Grief is associated with loss, and that loss can come in many different ways. It comes when you move. So you leave behind friends, you leave behind the familiar, you leave behind the home you loved, the people you interacted with.
Mm-hmm.
There are many different sources of grief. James and Friedman point to 43 in their book,
Mm-hmm.
and they're quoting the peer-reviewed literature in doing so.
Mm-hmm.
And to call some of these ambiguous and others real or solid forms of grief, I think is unfair to
Mm-hmm.
the people who are
Mm-hmm.
experiencing certain kinds of grief.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it may also be that labeling those types of grief as ambiguous is trying to reach people and help them recognize that they're feeling grief that they've buried because our
Hmm.
culture has told us, you lost your goldfish when you were 9 years old. It's just a goldfish, but you were nine and you really loved little Freddy the fish, and
And she's talking about me, and his name was Plinker, not Freddie.
oh,
Just to be
Plinker.
clear.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's
And so there's this constant approach and maybe even desire in
mm-hmm,
this culture
mm-hmm,
to grade different forms of grief
right.
differently. It was only a goldfish. It was only your pet dog. It wasn't a
Mm,
real person. It was only your grandmother, and she was 127 years old. She was going to
mm.
die anyway.
And it was so
These
long ago.
these are sources of grief
Right.
that people constantly grade differently.
Mm-hmm,
Your grief is less than mine because mine is happening now and it involves
mm-hmm,
me,
right.
and yours happened then and it only involved you.
Mm-hmm,
So, and this article in the New York Times Magazine, I think, plays into this idea
mm-hmm.
that there are different styles of grief and that they can be treated differently as a result. And Professor Bass's latest book, published in December of 2021, is called The Myth of Closure. And your take on that is something I would like to hear.
So I think it's a really great title because closure is something that everyone is talking about. We need closure. We've got to have closure. These things happened, and can we find closure? But what is closure? What does that actually mean, and what does it entail? Um, Most frequently, closure means that you've somehow worked through those feelings and you've numbed them, deadened them, or cut them off.
And that's the Freudian approach,
Right.
is to think about something else long enough, to not think about what is causing you grief
Mm-hmm.
long enough that it becomes dead.
Right.
You become numb to that pain,
Right.
and you just don't deal with it anymore. That's how you deal with it,
Right.
is by ignoring it long enough that you largely forget about it, as if that's possible.
And Professor Pauline Boss, is absolutely right. That is a myth. That's not real closure. And and maybe there is no closure, as the article's headline is. What if there is no such thing as closure?
Mm-hmm.
Because if we see closure as a way to just cut off our feelings, we're gonna we're gonna create more problems for ourselves down the road.
And that's a great point, and it falls just short in not mentioning the grief recovery method, in my opinion.
Right. Right.
The Grief Recovery Handbook does offer a
Mm-hmm.
way forward
Mm-hmm.
that involves a positive means of closure.
Yeah.
It is it's surgery in which you're trying to remove the splinter in the heart
Right.
instead of the splinter in the stomach or the other physical ailment.
Exactly. Well, and it's about actually feeling things, and I love that um, Professor Boss's point is that we need to feel these feelings. We need to have the feels, and this is real closure: is feeling your feelings, recognizing those feelings, and learning how to live with those feelings.
Less than a month after I completed the grief recovery workshop in Phoenix, Arizona, I found myself in Winnipeg, hosted by Jerry Coppola, and hosted specifically at the Buddhist center that he created and had led for many years. And he invited the world's leading authority, um, Don John Desjardins, to come from British Columbia and help us work through the notion of meditating on death and dying. He's the world's leading authority on that particular subject in the Buddhist tradition. And so I was there for a few days. For the first time ever, that Buddhist center and Jerry, who headed it, created a public format for me to speak They'd never done that before because this is not something that Buddhists do. They let you find your own way. They don't foist ideas upon you. And so there I was speaking at his request. And the whole time I was in Winnipeg, which is about a week, it was colder than it was on the surface of Mars. It was really, really cold. And we'd take a 20-minute break or so every now and then from our meditation. Everybody else got all bundled up, all these Winnipegians putting all their clothes. We'd take a 20-minute break. They'd spend 10 minutes putting their clothes on and 10 minutes taking their clothes off and spend 5 seconds out there in the cold, cold air of Winnipeg in February 2014. And I just put on a light sweater or a light jacket and went outside. And they would come out one at a time, sort of trickling out as they got themselves dressed. And they come out and they take one look at me and they'd say, "What are you doing, man? It is really cold here." Here's how cold it was. Canada had just come up with money that had plastic in it. So much plastic that people put it in their back pockets or put it in their pants pockets or in their coat pocket, and they'd take it out and it would just crumble into nothing. It had so much plastic in it. The cold caused it to disintegrate. And their public infrastructure was getting destroyed. These pipes that had been buried 8, 10, 12, 15 feet below ground suddenly were freezing.
So you're saying we can live on Mars?
It was unbelievably cold. People would come on and say, "What are you doing, man?" And I said, "I'm feeling it." I thought that was the point here. We're supposed to feel it. It was really, really cold. And yes, we can live on Mars for a few minutes. But at the end of the 20 minutes, I was inside trying to warm myself back up again. No, we can't live like that in that habitat
Tell
beyond
us
a few
more
minutes.
about the death meditation.
So John Desjardins, who later hosted me at his home when I was on tour in British Columbia, was such a kind, wonderful man. And he led these meditations about death and dying. And actually was among the first significant influences for me in having me think about the idea of living with death in mind. Because if you live that way, if you recognize, if you accept that you are going to die, that any moment might in fact be your last, then that, for many people, including me, encourages me, forces me basically to live with urgency. If you know you're going to die next week, then perhaps you should do something about those relationship issues that you've put off. Perhaps you should start to be honest with the people in your life. You should tell them the things now that you won't be able to tell them when you're dead or when they're dead. There's a lot that most of us could benefit from saying to the people we claim we love. And time is short. So let's go ahead and do that. So it was reinforcement for me to take those kinds of actions. In addition, because we'd just conducted the grief recovery workshop, it was reinforcement from the rational, emotional perspective that is promoted by the Grief Recovery Institute. And here we're seeing it in the Buddhist community as well, and the overlaps were amazing and amazingly frequent. So it was, all in all, just a very positive, wonderful experience. And I met some amazing people, even if they weren't as cold-hardy as you might think Winnipegans are.
Well, you had practice being from Idaho.
Right. That slips away quite quickly, as you know. As we're discovering here in Vermont, in the bitter cold.
You can see we're all bundled up. We're in an extension of this house that has no heating. It's a little chilly. So one of the things that Professor Boss talks about is ritual. And one of the problems that happened last year with the pandemic, early in the pandemic, people were dying and families weren't able to take those bodies and have ritual, like proper burials. And it was very traumatizing because death rituals are a part of our culture.
And there are so many instances where ritual isn't possible, or um, it wasn't made available. In the pandemic, people died, and families weren't allowed to see their relatives or to take the bodies. And you know personally how important ritual is.
It was about 14 months after my dad died that we finally were all able to get together, my family members, and we gathered at the campground where we spent at least a week, no, at least 2 weeks camping when I was a kid. And in addition to his sons and daughter and his surviving wife, there were the families of my sister and my brother who came as well. And what my dad expressed interest in having done upon his death was scattering his ashes at one of the high mountain lakes he loved to fish in. So we gathered at this campground and went out on what would have been his 84th birthday and scattered his ashes in these high mountain lakes. It was a little weird. It would have been a lot weirder had I not experienced a similar activity once before, a previous ash scattering ceremony. I'll get to that in a second. What's kind of funny about this one is it's a lot of ashes. You know, a dead body contains a lot of ashes, no matter how small the body is. There's a lot of stuff there. So we started out just sort of carefully grabbing a little bit and putting it in the lake or putting it underneath a bare grass plant or next to one of the fir trees that my dad knew the names of, and so on. And then it became obvious early on that that wasn't going to cut it. There's a lot of ashes there. So at the end, we were just dumping the bucket into various high mountain lakes as we came across them as we were driving out. The first time I experienced an ash scattering ceremony was when the professor who became a good friend after he was the point person in hiring me at the University of Arizona. And he was the faculty member who took the lead in the committee that ultimately ended up interviewing and then hiring me. And when his wife died, we all went out to the Saguaro National Park, Sonoran Desert, and there must have been 30 or 40 or 50 people there, all reaching in and grabbing a little bit of the recently deceased's ashes and taking them to a plant, a shrub or a wildflower or an arroyo that she would have loved. And I thought it was a little weird because I'd never felt anybody's ashes before, and I thought the whole thing was kind of bizarre. But then you have this shared experience with those 40 or 50 people who had also known and loved this individual. And not very far into it, we're telling stories about our shared interest with this woman and the kinds of activities we had all participated in together. And so after a while, everybody's laughing. And I think that's the importance of these ceremonies, is to ground people so that they don't dwell on their grief, but instead they dwell on their shared experiences, which turns out in many cases to be joyful times.
Yeah.
So this article does a good job of pointing out a lot of things, including the importance of rituals to ground people, to give people a sense that the focus is on this individual, the recently deceased individual, but there's life beyond that so far for the individuals who remain. So that's a really nice addition in this article.
Right, and there are instances where there is no such thing as a ritual, a closure ritual. For example, I mean, we don't necessarily have a ritual for ending a job, or being fired, or divorce. But I know people have created rituals for those situations to help them manage those feelings.
Some people have.
Yeah.
But it's not society-wide.
No, it's not in our culture.
No. It's not part of what we do when we leave a job, or when we leave friends, or when we get divorced, or on and on. As we already indicated, James and Friedman indicated 43 different kinds of loss that lead to grief.
And that's just the ones they indicated. There are many more. I would say that one of the big ones is losing your physical ability to move around without being in pain. That's a really big one.
Yeah, that happened to us a while ago.
We're starting to feel that. And
can you not shift so much? It kind of hurts my elbow.
right? It's you know, so there are so many different losses that people experience, and the, you know, labeling them ambiguous again is an ambiguous way of labeling actual loss. You know, people lose their legs, or they become paralyzed, or they develop Alzheimer's. That's a real loss, and we don't necessarily have ritual for that. And I think that's another great thing that the Grief Recovery Institute offers you, a type of ritual. And it's a process. You go through these different processes and you end them with this letter that you write, and it's wonderful. It's heartbreaking and heartwarming and inspiring, and it heals. It absolutely heals.
Absolutely. If you go through this process, and we've tried to guide many people through this process and have had very limited luck with it. We have not been very successful.
Because it's not a pill.
Right. It's not a simple fix that requires essentially no action on your own part.
Right.
Instead, it requires meditation. It requires deep thought. Some people don't like the word meditation, so we'll just call it deep thinking.
Right.
Deep thinking or deep thought. You have to actually engage with your feelings, and that's difficult for most people in this culture.
Yeah.
But once you do, these exercises are simple, straightforward, can be completed by almost anybody, and our experience has been uniformly positive for us and the people we know who have used these exercises, who've gone through the process. Is it challenging? Mentally, intellectually, emotionally? Yes, of course. Isn't anything that's worth doing at some level challenging?
But it doesn't.
A League of Our Own.
Right.
Remember A League of Our Own?
Right.
Where the coach, who played the coach?
Oh gosh.
Tom Hanks?
No. Kevin Costner.
Kevin Costner.
I
Really?
think so.
Anyway, in this long ago film
Right.
about women playing baseball,
Yeah.
he
With
points
Susan
out
Sarandon.
that if anything that's easy isn't worth doing. It's got to be difficult.
Yeah.
You know, flipping a coin for most of us is pretty easy.
Maybe I'm thinking of Bull Durham.
I think you are. Yes, you are. If you're thinking about Susan Sarandon and
Right. All those
Kevin,
baseball
yeah,
games.
right.
Right.
But this is a league of our own,
Yes.
the women's league
Right.
that grew up during World War II,
Yes.
when a majority of the young men were otherwise occupied.
Right.
And I can't remember who was in it,
Yeah.
because it's been a while. But the coach points out that if it was easy, it's not worth it. Anything worth doing has got to be challenging. It's got to be hard at some level, or why bother? And it's the same with the grief recovery method, going through those. And, you know, in retrospect, they were simple exercises for us. But at the time, they were not simple. At the time, they were heart-wrenching.
Yeah.
They required deep thought. They required reaching back into our memories and trying to come up with shared experiences with this person that we're trying to reach closure with. And it's hard. Life is hard sometimes.
Yeah. Like always.
Right.
Sometimes it's not hard. Usually it's hard. But the nice thing about it is that we were able to work through that grief recovery in a matter of days. So pretty much just a few hours. And instead of, you know, going to your therapist, which I think is not a bad idea for many people, but in therapy, you're going to be in therapy for a long time. That's just that's just the way it's going to be. But with this, you can work through deep grief very quickly.
Yes, and it's important.
Yeah.
It's important at a level that you are not going to get from your therapist or your counselor who you're paying, because you're paying for them to keep you in the grief, because that's where the money is.
Well, yeah. But I think they may not be so much that they want to keep you there for the money, but they're working on a different premise.
Absolutely.
And that premise may not be a very good one. And we might be trying to figure out a new way of healing. And I think that Pauline Boss is on the right track. I really do, with a few tweaks.
Mm-hmm.
And
just the addition of the grief recovery method in the grief recovery handbook bears mentioning in this article, and it didn't get a mention, of course.
Yeah.
And
well,
I don't know. I don't know if she's familiar with it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how you could not be if you've been doing grief work for 50 years as she's been doing.
Right.
How could you not? If you type in, I would imagine if you type in grief or grief recovery or grief symptoms or whatever at your favorite search engine. So the title of this article that we've been talking about in the New York Times Magazine is "What if there's no such thing as closure?" Closure. A closer.
Always be closing.
You know what a closer is? Speaking of baseball.
Oh.
He's the
baseball.
pitcher who comes in the last
right.
of the innings to
Right.
close it out.
Right.
To get the last 3 outs, typically.
Yeah.
Or sometimes just one. So that's the closer.
Right.
Anyway, sorry. The article from the New York Times Magazine, "What if there's no such thing as closure?" features Professor Emeritus Pauline Boss. And the part that I don't like about this article is that sometimes there is a way of reaching closure, and they don't mention it, and that's the grief recovery method. We're not selling anything here. We don't earn any money from the Grief Recovery Institute, but I've seen many cases where it could have been used beneficially for people, and it certainly was beneficial for me. I had no idea what grief was, what the process of grief recovery could be, or that it was even possible within an hour of attending this 3-day workshop. It had made an enormous positive difference in my life.
Yeah.
It's just amazing that one of the things that we so seldom talk about in this society, grief, much less grief recovery, is so important. It affects every one of us who lives past the age of 5.
Right.
And yet it's one of those things that is seemingly taboo in the society, talking about death, talking about dying, talking about grief, grieving, bodily function, all the important things that affect every one of our lives. Those are the things that seem to be taboo.
Yeah.
That's
The
annoying.
unspeakables.
Yes, the unspeakables.
Right. Well, this has been a good conversation.
Only if it gets recorded. I mean, yes, this has been a good conversation. And what we're trying to do here is highlight the importance of grief, and not only grief, but grief recovery, because we are in the time of a plague. We are in the time of dying at a very large scale. We are in the time of major grief and grieving.
Yeah.
Looking away is not going to fix it. Walking away is not going to fix it. Turning your shoulder to your grief or other people's grief is the wrong way to go.
Right. Pretending
And we know a better way.
Pretending it's going to go away or things are going to get better.
Or that it's a Chinese hoax.
Or
The plague, specifically. None of that is helpful.
No, it's not. No. There are so many things that people can do and become involved in death cafes, do research into death doulas, and of course, grab yourself a copy of the Grief Recovery Manual, Handbook.
Grief Recovery Handbook. the second 20-year anniversary edition that
Right.
came out in 2009, and complete those exercises. You might think they're not for you. They
Yeah.
are. They're for everybody because every one of us has experienced grief.
Loss.
Loss and the grief that comes along with that.
Right.
I love the definition of grief from the Grief Recovery Institute, wishing for a different past.
Mhm.
It reminds me of my longtime disdain of hope, which is wishing for a certain future, typically a different future than the one that's coming. That's basically how hope is defined, is wishful thinking about something in the future. And grief is wishing for a different past. You can't have either of those. All the wishing aside, you're not going to get what you want when it comes to grief, when it comes to hope. So, dealing with it in a rational manner, as the evidence-based grief recovery method does, I think is what we're pointing to as a positive way forward for a lot of people.
Yep.
You could do worse.
No.
Don't name my name. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you all for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Click the bell if you want to be informed about future videos.
And you can subscribe as a member, and you get additional perks like watching the bloopers from this.
For as little as 99 cents a month. Mostly though, thanks for watching.